Neoliberal policies also attack the whole notion of the public good and the belief that states had responsibility for taking care of their citizens, especially the weakest and most vulnerable. It advanced the notion that the market, which is really more of a euphemism for class processes, that this notion of the market was the sole regulator of social and economic processes. So one saw then the withdrawal of the state from the provision of social services such as education and health care, and the elimination of subsidies for food and price controls. And along the same lines then, many state entities were privatized. Mines, public utilities, airlines, telecommunications companies, hospitals, etc. Many of these were sold off at fire sale prices to people that today constitute a new group of billionaires in Latin America, who then passed them on to multinational corporations. The result of this for a lot of ordinary people was the rising cost of public services and more unemployment. Maybe Juan will talk about this in a minute, but the closure of the Bolivian tin mines in 1985 was perhaps one of the most spectacular examples of this. Literally with the stroke of a pen, Bolivian President Paz Estenssoro in 1985 decreed the closure of the Bolivian state tin mines, which threw about 20,000 tin miners and their families out of work, forced them to resettle either in the coca-producing zones of the country or to migrate to the big cities and find work if they could as taxi drivers, shoeshine boys, all sorts of work in what's commonly referred to as the informal economy, unstable, insecure, low paid, and so forth. Another result of neoliberal policies was the weakening of labor laws, which undermined unions, generated more employment. As a result, saw the rise of subcontracting, where a lot of work was subcontracted out to either individuals or firms, where workers were not unionized, benefits were not paid, wages were much lower, and workers, as a result, had much less ability to complain about working conditions, to ask for higher wages, and were much more vulnerable as a result. So the upshot of this was that neoliberalism put much more emphasis on individual responsibility, and through this kind of process of dispossession, if you want to call it that, made people more vulnerable, more responsible for solving their own problems with health, education, old age, employment, and so forth. It's not surprising that in many countries after neoliberal policies were adopted, crime waves erupted. We also, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, this was the era when in the Andean region the drug traffic explodes. Part of what was happening at the time was because peasants had no other alternative than to turn to the production of coca leaf, which is the primary ingredient in cocaine. Coca became their only viable economic alternative. So what's happening in Latin America today? How are these governments trying to deal with a whole host of new and old problems? Well, first of all, many of them are now trying to reassert greater control over natural resources. Oil, particularly lithium in Bolivia, it varies from country to country, but making sure that a larger portion of profits from the sale of these resources remain in the country and are directed to the poorest segments of society. Many governments are also taking up the whole issue of land reform, which is something that just really fell off of the policy agenda for 20 or 30 years. The reason they're taking up land reform is because this is a key issue for many of the social movements that brought these governments to power. In Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Brazil, they're powerful peasant movements that are really pushing the agenda of land reform. The new governments are also reasserting the role of the state in the provision of social welfare services, and they're also trying to assert their own economic independence from the United States. And by so doing, making themselves less susceptible to political pressure from the U.S. The way they're doing this is that many countries are now finding new markets for their products in Europe and Asia, especially China, and the creation of what's called the Bank of the South represents an effort to develop more regional integration among Latin American countries. This is a project that's been pushed a lot by Hugo Chavez. The big question that governments face in the region is the extent to which they'll be able to satisfy the demands of their bases in the context of a very severe recession, which hits Latin America much harder than it's hitting the United States. In El Salvador, for example, the decline in remittances from immigrants in the United States and the decline in U.S. demand for products produced in El Salvadoran factories is going to have an impact on FUNES's ability to increase government spending on subsidies for the production of food crops for domestic consumption, and also an increase in spending on health care. These are two of the things that he pledged to do in the election, but the extent to which he's going to be able to do it, given the constraints that this crisis is creating now, is an open question. And similar questions, I think, can be asked of other countries. A final point that I want to make about some of the changes in Latin America is that many countries, again with the notable exception of Colombia and Guatemala to a certain extent as well, have been dealing with the silence and the impunity that are the legacies of the 20th century dirty wars that racked Latin America for much of the middle and latter part of the 20th century. During this time, Latin American military supported by the United States killed or disappeared literally thousands of people from Argentina and Chile to El Salvador, Guatemala, and in between. But what we see nowadays in Argentina, for example, the Supreme Court in 2005 overturned amnesty laws that had protected military officers who committed human rights crimes during that country's dirty war between 1976 and 1983. And by 2006, many police, military, and intelligence officers who had enjoyed impunity for years, and actually in some cases had encounters in the streets of Buenos Aires with people that they had actually tortured, these people are now in custody and awaiting trial. And in sort of a symbolic gesture, both the governments of Chile and Argentina converted notorious torture centers into museums of memory where the lives of people who died there can now be commemorated, and what actually happened during the dirty wars can be made more public. Ecuador has announced that U.S. bases on its territory are going to close when the lease expires at the end of this year. Unfortunately, though, with Colombia right next door, at least one of these bases is going to move to a very conflicted part of Colombia, the Middle Magdalena region, and Camilo might have more to say about that. Okay, I think I'm kind of running out of time here, so I want to just make sort of one last point, which I think now, given what's happening in Latin America, now is a good time for the United States to chart a new foreign policy in Latin America. The question is the Obama administration up to the task? I would argue no, but I think that's something we might want to take up in discussion. Okay, so Camilo is the next speaker.